Hello and welcome. This is the first lecture in part 1 of a multi-part lecture series on the foundations of bioethics. The purpose of this lecture series is to introduce graduate level students to the study of ethics and bioethics. I am approaching this lecture series with the underlying assumption that students are coming into this course with little to no prior formal education in ethics. Therefore, part 1 of the series is going to focus on bioethics of a field of study. In this first lecture of part 1, I will be defining ethics, moral conflict, and bioethics. I like to include a slide of objectives for all of the lectures that I write. So as you go through this course, you're going to find that the second slide of every lecture is an objective slide. I encourage you to think of this slide as the roadmap of not only where we are going in the lecture, but what I want you to focus on and gain from the lecture. Therefore, at the end of this lecture, you should be able to define ethics, differentiate between the concepts of right and correct, discuss the relationship between moral conflict and ethics, and finally, be able to define bioethics. So what is ethics? Simply stated, ethics is the philosophical study of morality, or moral philosophy. Breaking this term down, morality looks at the standards of character and conduct, and philosophy is the critical examination of morality against reason and scientific truth. Therefore, at the most basic level, ethics is the study of what makes something right or wrong. There are two main subcategories that we can break ethics down into: normative ethics and metaethics. Normative ethics looks for authoritative rules or directions that can be applicable for all people in all situations and can tell us what are right actions and what is good character. And the main components of normative ethics is that it should be applicable to everybody in every situation at every time, and answer two ought questions. What ought I do and what ought I be? What ought I do is looking at what are these right actions for human beings, as well as what are the wrong actions for human beings. What ought I be is looking at your character. What makes a good character? What is good character? And what are these goals that we should be aiming for to achieve in our own character to be the best person we can be? While normative ethics is looking for rules and directions, metaethics is looking at judging values and obligations. It's investigating the origin of where do these ethical concepts come from? Where do these ideas of what ought I do and what ought I be, what are they grounded in? What does it actually mean to be morally good? And that leads us to some other questions, such as, is there objective right and wrong, independent of our individual human opinions? Are there discoverable absolute standards that we can use to determine right and wrong in every situation? In other words, metaethics is looking at, does normative ethics actually exist? Is it possible or is it an ideal? And what do right and wrong depend on? Are they context-based? Are they consequence-based? And is this always the case? I want to pause for a minute and focus on this idea of right and wrong, and really focusing on the concept of right. Oftentimes, people use the word right and correct interchangeably, but when it comes to the discipline of ethics, there is an essential difference between right and correct. When something is correct, it is factually true. It is something that is able to be supported beyond a reasonable doubt, something that is confirmed. For example, if we are working in a base 10 system, then 2 plus 2 equals 4. That is correct. Right has to do with moral truth. Right has to do with this concept of what ought we do. So when we're talking about the discipline of ethics, we're not just talking about what is correct. We're not talking about what does a textbook tell me. What we are looking for is much more personal. And how do we take the information, the correct information that is available to us, and then apply that to know what we ought to do and what is the best decision from what we ought to do. So as a discipline, ethics really has two tasks, and we're going to address both of those tasks in this course. The first task of ethics is to examine ethical systems, to examine different foundations of what ought to happen, what should be defined as right, what is the moral truth. And those are ethical theories. And we will take some time to look at different ethical theories relevant to healthcare and bioethics. The other task of ethics is to actually examine real-world ethical problems and apply those theories in specific scenarios and situations. What ought I do when this situation comes up? What theories and systems ought I apply? And that is when we get into the concept of applied ethics. Let's discuss this concept of applied ethics and what ought I do when an ethical dilemma arises. For many people today, some things are always going to be right or always going to be wrong, regardless of the context. However, other people believe that right and wrong should always depend on either cultural or individual preference and context. Clearly, these two belief systems are going to clash. They can't both possibly be true, as they represent radically different ways for making sense of life. This leads to the predicament that an action that is acceptable according to one belief system may not therefore be acceptable according to a different belief system. This clash of different belief systems is what we call moral conflict. Moral conflict occurs when disputants are acting within different beliefs about how the world operates. According to James Davison Hunter, a professor of sociology from the University of Virginia, underlying moral conflict is the innate struggle to define who and what we are. Hunter frames this competition to define what we are as a struggle to define such fundamental matters as human nature, good and evil, truth and authority, and meaning and value. Who we are, in contrast, tends to be a more practical question. The question of who we are explores social relationships involving power and authority. Who we are is about standards of how we order our lives and govern ourselves. How one chooses to answer the questions of who and what we are provides guidelines for the age-old question of what is the ideal society and how should society operate? According to Hunter, there are two extremes for answering this question. Hunter refers to the two extremes as cultural adversaries, which he termed the orthodox and the progressivist. Orthodoxy is committed to a view of reality that is independent of, prior to, and more powerful than the human experience. Orthodoxy believes in an external, definable, transcendent source of authority. In other words, the answers to who and what we are absolute. They are constant. And the answers come to us from an omniscient authority, such as the God of the Bible or another consistent deity. In contrast, progressivism does not tell us once and for all what we are, but prescribes to a reality, truth, and authority that is ever unfolding. Progressivists believe that matters of good and bad, right and wrong, are not predetermined by a higher authority, but are rather left for us as human beings to determine. People are responsible to set the ground rules for conduct both personally and socially, making who and what we are debatable, flexible, and changeable. Why do I bring up moral conflict in a lecture introducing us to ethics and bioethics? Because bioethics, as you're going to learn in this course, is less about the specific issues and more about the underlying moral conflicts that these issues are grounded in. As you will discover as we advance through this course and look at ethical dilemmas, controversies innate to bioethics are not about procedural matters, but about fundamental disagreements over the conception of reality, truth, and goodness. Before we dive into discussing bioethical dilemmas, let me backtrack for a second and define for you bioethics. Bioethics is comprised of two Greek words, bios, meaning life, and ethos, meaning character or custom. The word ethics comes from ethos, which suggests that bioethics is an application of ethics to the life sciences, specifically sciences of medicine and healthcare. Thus, bioethics derives its content and focus from biology and medicine, and its theory and guiding principles from the larger field of ethics. Stated otherwise, bioethics is an umbrella term that encompasses a number of subspecialties that address ethical issues that arise in the healthcare setting, including clinical ethics, organizational ethics, and research ethics. Bioethics is an integral part of the work that all healthcare professionals do every day and the healthcare organizations in which they practice. Bioethical dilemmas focus on the well-being and dignity of the patient, matters of choice and decision-making, rights and responsibilities of patients, families, and the care team, responsibilities of the healthcare organization, access to care, and fairness and justice within healthcare policy. Thus, at the intersection of medicine, law, and moral conflicts, we find bioethics.